Volume 1, Chapter 3, of The Life and Amours of the Beautiful, Gay, and Dashing Kate Percival, the Belle of the Delaware. This is a Librvox recording. All Librvox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life and Amours of Kate Percival, written by herself. Volume 1, Chapter 3, A New Scene. After Harry's departure, my father's house grew more and more distasteful to me, and I resolved to make an effort to leave it. One day I went to him and expressed a wish to take a situation as governess. He made but slight objections, and at last gave his consent. I immediately sent an advertisement to the Philadelphia papers and received several answers. Amongst them was one from a Mr. Herbert Clarence, who lived in the village of Chester. He offered me such advantageous terms that I at once accepted them, and the next day started for my new home. Riverside Lodge, as Mr. Clarence's residence was called, was situated on the banks of the Schuylkill, and was fitted up with all the elegance wealth could command. The grounds were handsomely laid out, the gardens cultivated to the extreme of art, and, in short, it bore more resemblance to the residences we meet on the other side of the water, which are occupied by the proud aristocracy of England, than the mansion of a simple American gentleman. Nature, too, had done an immense deal to enhance the beauties of the dwelling. The scenery around was pastoral and beautiful. What it wanted in grandeur it more than made up, with the picturesque view to be seen from all sides of the house. The lodge was situated on a rising hillock and fronted the river, from which it was not more than 100 yards distant. To the north of the house was a thick wood, containing trees of many years' growth. In this sylvan retreat Mr. Clarence had fitted up rustic chairs and seats, and in the heat of the summer it afforded a delightful shelter from the sun's rays. On both the other sides of the dwelling was a handsome sloping lawn, also covered by fine trees. I was met at the door of the house by the owner, a fine, handsome man of about 35 years of age. He introduced me to his wife, a confined invalid who never left her chamber. I then saw my pupils, 2 little girls, the eldest not more than 6 years of age. I found Mr. Clarence to be a perfect gentleman, courteous, polite, and agreeable. I soon felt quite at home with him. Mrs. Clarence never interfered with me, and days passed without my even seeing her. I pitied poor Mr. Clarence having such a sick wife, for it was easy to be seen that he was a man of a very amorous temperament, and it was also certain that his wife could afford him no satisfaction in this respect. I was naturally thrown much into Mr. Clarence's society, and noticed that he daily grew more tender to me. When shaking hands with me he would press my hand and retain it in his, and when I wore a low-necked dress, I observed that his eyes were fixed on my white shoulders, and that when he caught a glimpse of my bosom his face would flush, and a decided protuberance would manifest itself in his pantaloons. Things went on in this way for 2 months. Then one day Mr. Clarence asked me if I would like to go out riding with him. I had always been fond of equestrian exercises, and consented very willingly. The horses were brought round to the door, and I mounted a handsome bay pony, while my companion rode a large grey horse which appeared but half broken. Mr. Clarence assisted me to mount, and in doing so I exposed a considerable portion of my limbs, my petticoats getting entangled in the saddle. When he saw my leg above the knee, for I wore no drawers, a crimson flush suffused his face, but it was not one of shame, but desire. He recovered himself, however, almost immediately, and off we started. We had ridden about 6 or 7 miles, when Mr. Clarence's horse suddenly took fright and galloped off with him. At the turn of the road, from some cause or other, the rider was thrown off and deposited on the green sward. Fortunately he was not injured. His horse, however, galloped away towards Riverside Lodge.
"A pretty situation, Miss Percival,"
said Clarence as he rose to his feet.
"Here am I, 6 miles from home, and nothing left for me but to tramp it on foot."
"Nay, Mr. Clarence, that must not be. If you do not mind, you can ride behind me. The pony can bear us both very well, and we can proceed slowly."
"I am afraid to discommode you, Miss Percival."
"Not at all. Our ancestors, you know, used to ride pillion."
"I accept your kind offer,"
he returned, and springing on the pony's back took his place behind me. He passed one arm around my waist for the purpose of holding himself securely in his position. We then slowly started in the direction of the lodge. We had not advanced a mile, however, before I felt something pressing stiffly against my bottom. My previous experience made me know what it was, and you may easily believe, dear reader, that I began to feel a strange sensation running through me. Whether my companion detected my sensations or not, I cannot say, but certain it is that the arm that encircled my waist was raised until his hand rested on my bosom outside my riding habit. However, I made no attempt to remove it, and encouraged, doubtless, by my seeming tacit consent to his enterprises, he furtively inserted 2 of his fingers in the opening in front of my dress, and I felt them on my naked breast. The contact of my bubbies appeared to electrify him, for I felt his staff of love beating against my buttocks still more plainly than before. "Mr. Clarence," said I, "this is wrong. Remember you have a wife."
My darling girl,
he replied,
I cannot help it. I am deeply enamoured with you. My wife is sick and unable to receive my embraces. Dearest Kate, be kind to me. I swear I will not injure you.
What could an amorous, love-sick girl reply? I was too fond of sexual pleasures to refuse them when time and opportunity offered. I made no reply whatever. My silence evidently encouraged him, for he now unbuttoned the front of my habit and placed his hand on my naked breasts, moulding them and titillating the strawberry nipples. With his other hand he managed to raise my petticoats from behind, and I felt myself sitting bare-bottomed on his lap. This was not all, for between my fleshy thighs was his instrument, which he had managed to disengage from his pantaloons. He now raised me up slightly, and in another moment his hand invaded my mossy crevice. No sooner did his fingers come in contact with the hair surrounding the domain of Venus than all reserve left him, and, inclining me slightly forward, he directed his instrument and in a moment forced it into my moist and burning passage, and drove it home with a sudden plunge. "Oh, God! Mr. Clarence! How delicious!" I exclaimed, when I felt the hair surmounting his pubes tickling my bottom, and I wiggled myself from side to side on his splendid staff. The pony now began to canter, and the motion he made was sufficient to cause his lance to move in and out of me. During this exciting proceeding, Clarence was titillating my clitoris in front, and turning my head around he kissed my lips in the most passionate manner. The pony really seemed to have some idea of what was being transacted on his back, for he set off in a gallop which soon brought a climax to our pleasure, for we both discharged simultaneously. He then withdrew his weapon, and we proceeded quietly home, indulging, however, in most delicious conversation on the way. When we reached Riverside Lodge, we dismounted and entered the drawing-room. It was unoccupied.
Darling girl,
said Herbert,
I must enjoy you once more. We shall not be interrupted.
I am yours, dear Herbert. Do with me as you please, I replied. He led me to a sofa and laid me on my back, and then threw my clothes up above my navel. He paused a while to gaze on my hidden charm, and ran his hands over the various objects that met his gaze.
What magnificent limbs! What splendid thighs! He exclaimed. And what a graceful, rounded and polished belly! And then what a delicious mons veneris! What a profusion of curly hair adorns this lovely spot! He was not content with the unveiled charms of the lower portion of my body, but he must needs release my large and plump breasts, and these afforded him a new theme on which to expatiate. He did not moralize long, but unbuttoning his pantaloons he released his stiff lance, and, bringing it to bear between my widely stretched thighs, I soon felt it forcing its way into my sensitive vagina. I raised my buttocks to meet his thrusts, and experienced the most delicious sensation. His motions grew quicker, and the end approached. I wiggled my bottom from side to side. I gave utterance to my rapture in words, sighs, and exclamations of pleasure, and received his whole discharge at the same moment that I myself emitted. When he had finished, he leaned over and kissed my breasts, and assisted me to rise. We heard steps approaching the room, and I hastily retired to my chamber.
My time after the adventure with Mr. Clarence passed very agreeably. My amorous desires were fully satisfied, and I enjoyed a repetition of the scenes I had passed through with my cousin. I found Herbert very ardent and very ingenious in his mode of performing the sexual act. I shall have to refer to some of his experiments by and by. One day I was informed that Mr. Clarence's sister-in-law was coming to spend a few weeks at Riverside Lodge. Herbert gave me the information with manifest pleasure painted on his face, and I felt sure her coming pleased him. For my own part, I cannot say that I was especially delighted, for I was afraid her presence would interfere with our enjoyments. On the appointed day, a carriage drove up to the entrance, and Amy Denmead, Mrs. Clarence's sister, alighted. The moment I saw her, truth compels me to state that she was one of the most beautiful women I had ever beheld. She was about 20 years of age, above the medium height, and her form was moulded in the most exquisite manner. Her face was really lovely, her features faultless, her complexion fair as Parian marble, and yet the hue of health was on her cheeks, the white and red contrasting in admirable manner. Her hair was a dark glossy brown, and hung in natural ringlets on her snowy neck and shoulders. Her bosom was full, voluptuous, and beautifully rounded. Her hands and feet were small, almost to a fault. Her carriage was full of grace, and when she smiled she allowed to be seen a row of pearly teeth which, if they had been cut out of a solid piece of ivory, could not have been more regular. When I was introduced to her she received me with a good deal of warmth in her manner, and observed that she was certain we would be good friends. During the evening she asked me if I had any objections to her sleeping with me, as she was too timid to sleep alone. I replied that I should be very happy for her to share my bed. We retired early, as she was tired from her journey. She undressed very quickly, and was soon between the sheets. I quickly followed her example. The moment I lay by her side she clasped me in her arms and pressed a warm kiss on my lips. I returned it, for I began to feel attracted by this delicious creature, and the warm contact of her beautiful semi-globes to mine sent a thrill through me. But we made no further progress that night, confining ourselves to conversation only. She asked me a great many questions concerning Herbert Clarence, as to how I liked him, how he behaved towards me, and 100 other interrogatories. At last we went to sleep. When I awoke the next morning, I found Miss Denmead already risen. I got up, dressed myself, and went down to seek her. I searched the house and found she was not there, and then came to the conclusion that she must have gone into the garden for a stroll. I followed, and directed my steps to a summer-house situated at the bottom of the lawn. The pathway that led to it was of grass, so that the sound of footsteps could not be heard. When I approached the arbor I heard the rustling of a dress inside, and instead of opening the door I peeped through the keyhole. Great God! I saw a sight which sent the blood boiling through my veins. Herbert Clarence was reclining on his back on a divan which he had drawn into the middle of the floor. His pantaloons were slipped down to his heels, leaving the whole of the lower portion of his body uncovered. Straddling him, with one foot resting on the ground and with the other on the divan, was the beautiful Amy. Her dress was open in front, leaving her splendid breasts entirely bare. Her petticoats were elevated above her navel and thrown behind her white belly, her voluptuous thighs, her magnificent limbs, and above all that masterpiece of nature, her lovely mons veneris entirely exposed to my gaze, for she stood directly facing me. His instrument had penetrated the luscious lips of her slit. While I was watching he gave one tremendous heave upwards with his buttocks, and sent it into her body clear up to his testicles. She was evidently gorged with delight and enraptured, for her lovely face expressed the most intense enjoyment, and by the quivering of her eyelids I felt assured the crisis would soon come. They now commenced to move together, he directing his thrusts upwards while she worked her bottom in reply to his motions. While this delicious play was going on, I could distinctly see his staff entering in and out of her coral sheath, the lips of which embraced it so tightly that they seemed to be afraid it should escape from them. It was the most voluptuous sight I had ever seen. As the acme approached, Amy leaned over and kissed Herbert. Their tongues sought each other's mouths, and they imitated the sexual act. So intense was their feeling of pleasure that they actually bit each other. The working of his lance in her sensitive vagina caused a suction sound delightful to hear.
"Dear Herbert, I am coming,"
suddenly exclaimed the lovely girl. These words seemed to increase Clarence's ardor, for he commenced to work his bottom with lightning rapidity, and, suddenly giving a tremendous push upwards, which she replied to by a corresponding motion downwards, they both remained motionless, his staff so deeply engulfed in her that the hair of their genitals was intermingled. Convulsive movement then seized her whole frame, and she fell on his belly. He was still embedded in her. They remained motionless for 10 minutes, when she opened her eyes and kissed Herbert repeatedly on the lips. The warmth of her caresses appeared to reanimate him, and he returned her embraces.
"I must go now, darling,"
said she.
"Someone may come."
I must once more taste the delights of heaven,
he returned.
We shall have no opportunity until tomorrow, dear Amy, and I am not half satisfied yet.
He withdrew himself from her, and wiping the throne of love gently with his pocket-handkerchief, he stooped down and kissed her mons veneris. He then drew her on his knee and began gently to titillate her clitoris with his finger, she performing her part by covering and uncovering the ruby head of his lance. They continued this play for some little time, every motion evidently bringing them nearer the consummation.
"Herbert, I shall spend if you continue your titillations much longer,"
said Amy, beginning to wriggle her buttocks.
Come then, darling,
replied Herbert.
I too am ready.
And so saying, he reclined her on the divan, and taking her thighs in his arms, he drove his lance to the hilt into her body. They seemed no longer to know what they were about. Joined as they were together, they seemed to experience the utmost voluptuousness. Amy especially appeared to be enjoying the delights of heaven. Her rapid movements, her exclamation of supreme pleasure, the trembling of her eyelids, and the convulsive manner in which she pressed Herbert's bottom was sufficient proof of her intense pleasure. A few reciprocal motions, and they again discharged. They now rose, adjusted their clothing, and I thought it better to retire, which I immediately did. A few minutes afterwards Amy entered, apparently as fresh as ever, and greeting me with a kiss, stating that she had been taking a long walk. I did not say a word, determined to take my own time to tell what I had seen. That night, when we retired to bed, Amy addressed a few words to me and then fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning she was still sleeping. I turned down the bedclothes and found that the lower portion of her body was entirely naked. Her nightdress, too, was open in the front, leaving her delicious breasts exposed. They were firm, round, and white as the driven snow, and surmounted by delicate pink nipples. Her beautiful hair covered the pillow like a veil. Her ruby lips were slightly separated, revealing her pearly teeth, and her lovely cheeks were tinged with a slight color which made her appear most lovely. Her belly was the smoothest and whitest I had ever seen. Her magnificently molded thighs were stretched widely apart, and at the lower part of her belly was her glorious domain of Venus. It was indeed a pretty bijou. Imagine to yourself, dear reader, a hillock surmounted with curly brown hair, between which could be seen the pouting lips to the entrance of bliss, folded so closely together that a line of coral only showed where they joined. It was a sight that would have tempted an anchorite. I do not know what possessed me, but I leaned over her and imprinted a kiss on that fountain of delight. I then gently divided the lips with my finger and sought for her clitoris, which I soon had swelling under my touches. In a few moments it grew quite stiff. A shiver of delight ran through the lovely girl, but she did not awake. With a finger of my other hand I penetrated into the coral passage, and began to move it rapidly in and out, while with my other finger I titillated her vagina. Amy, still asleep, replied to my titillations by working her bottom up and down.
"Oh, Herbert,"
she exclaimed.
"It is too delightful. Faster, darling, faster."
I moved my finger with such extreme rapidity I could feel her vagina beginning to contract on my finger. She wiggled herself to and fro.
"I am coming, darling. Dear Herbert, I am come.
She could utter no more, but pushing her bushy mount close up to my hand, I felt my fingers endowed with the love potion I had distilled from her. At the moment of discharging she awoke, and opening her eyes gazed with astonishment on me.
"Is it you, dear Kate?"
she exclaimed as soon as she could recover her breath. She seemed suddenly to remember and hesitated to finish her sentence. "You thought it was Herbert Clarence," I remarked. The lovely girl blushed, but made no reply. "I saw your proceedings with him yesterday in the arbour," I continued, "but do not be alarmed, dear Amy, for I am willing to confess he has done exactly the same thing to me."
"If that be the case, there need be no reserve between us,"
replied Amy, and raising from her reclining posture, she seized me by the waist, and throwing me on the bed, she divested me of my chemise almost before I knew what she was about. When she saw my naked body, she uttered an exclamation of pleasure, and ran her hands rapidly over my charms. She first of all kissed and moulded my bubbies, sucking the very nipples. From this she descended to my belly, smoothing it down with her soft hand. At last she attacked me in the very centre of pleasure, running her fingers on the hair surmounting my mons veneris, opening the lips and gazing curiously in the ruby cavity. Then she seized on my clitoris, exciting it with her lascivious touches, and at last, as if unable to control herself longer, she forced a finger into the deepest recesses of my vagina, and commenced to move it rapidly in and out. "Amy, Amy," I exclaimed, "you are killing me with pleasure."
"Have you not given me the most intense enjoyment this morning, and shall I not be equally kind to you? But stay, darling," she continued. "I have something that will give you even greater delight."
She suddenly desisted from her manipulations, and running through her trunk took from it an india-rubber dildo, shaped exactly like a man's instrument.
"This is what I amuse myself with when alone,"
said she.
"And now I am going to give you a taste of it. Place yourself on your knees, dear Kate, and recline your head on the pillow."
I placed myself in the position she indicated, by which means my buttocks were elevated high in the air.
"How glorious you look in this position, Kate,"
said Amy, pressing her hands over my bottom.
"What a pretty object is your bayou between your swelling thighs. How closely the plump lips come together, and how delicately they are shaded by the curling hair growing on that precious buttock. I must kiss it."
So saying, she stooped down and imprinted a long kiss on the object presented to her regard. Nay, she did more, for I actually felt her tongue divide the mysterious portals of Venus, and penetrate into the most secret recesses of my covered way of love, rendering me almost crazy with the delicious titillation. She was one of the most lascivious girls I ever met with, and evidently enjoyed one of her own sex almost as much as she did one of the male kind. She moved her tongue rapidly for a few moments, and I verily believed, had she continued 5 seconds longer, I should have spent in her mouth. But she suddenly ceased.
"Now, darling, for something more substantial,"
she exclaimed, and bringing the point of the dildo to the entrance of my vagina, she suddenly plunged it to the very hilt into my glowing sheath. She now commenced to move it in and out of me somewhat slowly, as if for the purpose of prolonging my exquisite feelings. Soon, however, she saw by the motion of my buttocks that I was on the eve of discharging, and placing her hand scientifically between my thighs, she titillated my clitoris and bottom at the same moment, while with the other hand she drove the dildo with lightning rapidity into my lustful cavity. I could hold out no longer. "I must come, dearest Amy," I gasped. There. And with a half-murmured ejaculation of pleasure, I poured down a flood of love's tide and sank motionless on my belly in the bed. In a few minutes I recovered, and we both lay side by side. Again and again we tasted bliss in each other's arms. I sought to repay her for the delight she had afforded me, and I may say I succeeded. At last we were unable to do anything more, and fell asleep in each other's arms. We were awakened by a tap at the door. Amy rose up and ran to open it, and who should be there but Mr. Clarence? A few hurried whispers ensued between them, then Herbert stepped into the room.
"Dear Kate,"
said he, coming to me as I lay in bed.
"Amy has informed me that you have come to a good understanding together, and I need not tell you how much gratified I am to hear it. God forbid that 2 such beautiful girls should be rivals. I love you both, and I believe I can satisfy you both. My wife tomorrow goes to Philadelphia to spend a few days. There is no reason we should not enjoy pleasure all together. I propose that tomorrow evening shall be our initiation. We shall have the house entirely to ourselves. Do you consent, Kate?"
"Willingly," I replied, jumping up from my bed, regardless of the exposure of my person, and throwing my arms around his neck, I kissed him on the lips.
"What do you say, Amy? Do you consent?"
"I shall like it most of all things,"
replied his sister-in-law, following my example. As we both hung about his neck, he pressed us to him, and the sight of our naked charms evidently affected him, and I thought he would then and there give us proof of his prowess. But he controlled himself, and advised us to husband our strength for the following night as he intended to do. He then kissed us both and retired from the chamber. End of Volume 1, Chapter 3.